Well, Joseph Pearce, thank you so much for being with me here today.
Oh, it's a joy to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I am really looking forward to this. We were just talking a little bit back and forth about how this is a episode that I'm personally very excited about because as I usually talk about theology, which we'll certainly do today, we're also going to expand a little bit and talk about the humanities, the great books, which is a passion of mine that I'm excited to kind of bring people into here. And you've written extensively on literature. And I want to kind of start with where you start your book, Literature, What Every Catholic Should Know, which, by the way, the link for that in your website will be in the description down below if people want to check it out. But you say, there's a good reason for every Catholic to know the great works of literature, and that is because the great works of literature help us to know ourselves. This is the reason that we should learn the humanities, because the humanities teach us about humanity, both our own humanity and the humanity of our neighbors. So, two questions. They might seem self evident, but I think it's important to kind of get into this before we go off and talk about it for an hour. To start, why should we care to know ourselves?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a question to be answered and approached in many ways. Yeah, I could begin, for instance, paradoxically, but with a quote from G.K. Chesterton, who said that the self is more distant than any star, and that we'll know every secret of the physical cosmos before we know ourselves. So, in one sense, of course, we're a mystery. So we're not going to know ourselves in the absolute sense that God knows us. But the more that we do know ourselves, the more we will understand who we are, who our neighbors are, what the cosmos is, and our place within it, and our relationship with all of those things, including our relationship with ourselves. So if we don't know or refuse to know or don't care about knowing who we are as human beings, we're dooming ourselves ultimately to a miserable and meaningless existence, which normally ends in despair. So there's all sorts of good reasons why we should make a point of knowing ourselves. And of course, from a Christian perspective, we should know ourselves on the deepest level, which is that we are the Imago Dei, that we're made in the image of God. And that what is it about us that makes us different from other creatures? Because in some sense, of course, everything in creation is made in the image of God, in the sense that it was His imagination that brought things into being. So, in some sense, a tree is made in the image of God because God thought it into being. But we're made in the image of God in a deeper sense because we're like God in the way that trees and other creatures aren't. In other words, and this is principally, I think, um, uh, what the Greeks would call the good, the true, and the beautiful, the transcendentals. And I believe when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," He's saying, "I'm the good, the true, and the beautiful." So the Imago Dei in us, insofar as it is the image of Christ in us, is the goodness, truth, and beauty in us, which is the good is the way to God Himself through virtue, through love. The truth is the logos is the way to God through reason, and the beautiful is the way to God through life. And the paradoxical thing about beauty is that beauty is the life in things. You have to see you have to be alive yourself to see the life in something else. By the way, I don't mean biological life. I mean, you could talk, the life of a sunset. It's the life of God's presence in the thing being beheld. Well, you have to have God's life in you to behold the life of the thing you're beholding. So for me, beauty is the life in things and the life of things and the relationship between the beholder of the beautiful and the beautiful itself. So all of that is part of who we are. And if we don't understand that, then we're living a very impoverished, spiritually and psychologically penurious existence.
Oh, I love that. And we've got a $5 vocab word there at the end, penurious. I want to ask so, it doesn't take a lot to sell me on the idea that we should know ourselves, but I think it's helpful to start there. And I like how you connected that with our knowledge of going back to God, and that we're made in God's image, and that in knowing ourselves, we can in some way know God and also the people around us. I think the next piece of the puzzle that I'd like to connect here is how does literature help us do that? I can imagine people saying, perhaps people that maybe have a less optimistic view of fiction, especially saying, like, what do false stories have to tell me about the truth of myself? There's a lot packed in there, but how does literature help us learn about ourselves?
Well, first of all, that I think that it's evident that God shows us himself through the telling of stories. And the most obvious story that he tells us is his story, which we call history, and understood his presence within it being salvation, his story, his story of salvation, salvation history. And of course, he enters the story himself in a sense when he becomes incarnate within a physical cosmos. And that was called, of course, the famous Hollywood movie on the gospel, the greatest story ever told. The greatest story ever told is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, becoming incarnate and presenting and showing himself to us, revealing himself to us in a way that we can understand God's presence, which we could not do if we only saw it in the abstract. And then, of course, within that story that Jesus enters, he tells us some of his most powerful lessons through the telling of stories. And for those people that spurn fiction, I'm going to cause scandal here by suggesting that the prodigal son is a fictional character who never existed in history, was merely a figment of our Lord's imagination. And yet the power of that fictional narrative is such that whenever any of us have heard that story or read that story for the last 2,000 years since it was first told, we don't say the prodigal son is like us. We say we are like the prodigal son. In other words, the fictional character is an archetype of which we are types. In some sense, we are less real than the fictional character that Christ presents to us. So if Jesus himself is happy to use fictional narrative to teach truth, then surely we should be happy in discovering truth through fictional narrative.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and it strikes me that the image of the prodigal son, or the story of the prodigal son, better put, has not had such lasting impact because we're really obsessed with the trying to figure out who this historical man of the prodigal son is, right? And it's not even just that it's a really good story, but it's that so often we reflect on ourselves in that we are the prodigal. And as you were talking, it reminded me of that great scene where David is confronted by the prophet Nathan, I think it is, and Nathan tells him a story, right, about a man who has cheated on with another man's wife, and he goes like, "Oh, how could someone do that?" Only for him to realize that it's a story about himself. And so fiction can be a sort of mirror in that way that, as Chesterton put it, that we're such a mystery to ourselves. Perhaps it's a way of kind of unraveling some of the layers of that mystery to see more clearly that we're not able to do generally. And I want to talk about, so we've talked about how books can help us do this, and as we're going to go through this conversation, we're going to talk about the great works, right, and good books. I imagine that one element of a good book is that it helps us discover ourselves. But as we kind of wade into this on the great works, what is it that makes a book good? Because I recognize that some people will come to a conversation like this and think, okay, these guys are just being pretentious. They're trying to tell me, like, gatekeep literature by saying this is good and that's not. And, what if I just like it? So if what makes a book good, is part of it that it helps us understand ourselves? Is that all of it? Or what are the aspects of a good book?
Well, I've written in the past about there being, logically speaking, and simply speaking, we need to elaborate and nuance this, but logically speaking, there are four types of books. There are good books. There are good bad books. There are bad good books, and there are bad books. And what I'm saying there is a book can be good in terms of its beauty, in terms of its literary merit, and it can be good in terms of the extent to which it makes manifest or mirrors the goodness, truth, and beauty of the cosmos and our place within it. So, in other words, it can be good as art, as beauty, and it can be good as goodness, truth, and beauty, right? And some books are good in both senses, and they're the great books. Some books are good as art and bad as morality. Some books are bad as art and good at morality. An awful lot of recently published Christian fiction is good morality, bad art. And not all, by the way. There's some very good stuff out there too. I don't want to be seen to be dismissing a lot of good contemporary Christian literature. And then the bad, of course, it's bad as art and bad as morality, and who in the right mind would want to even touch that? But so that if you understand it in that sense, then the great books are those that pass both of those litmus tests. They're good in terms of art, in the manifestation of the beauty of the gift, and they're also good in terms of the reflecting the goodness, truth, and beauty of the moral order as created by God.
Okay, this is really interesting to me, and I'm going to steal this framework from you. I'll attribute it to you, but I'm fascinated by this. The good, the good bad, or the good books, the bad good books, the good bad books, and the bad books. I think to help people kind of get some handles on this, maybe we can dive into some examples, perhaps. Not for the sake of kind of calling people out, but maybe just for getting a sense of how this works. And there's going to be, perhaps some subjectivity involved here, but I think the goal of this framework is to say that like a book can have an objective quality of being good or not in the moral sense and in the artistic sense. So a book that's top of mind for me, I just finished reading The Stranger by Albert Camus. And it is a book that is haunting in that the morality of it is terrifying. The spoiler alert for those that haven't read The Stranger is it's essentially a story about a guy who I would describe as probably a nihilist insofar as he just reacts to his sense pleasures, and one day he kills someone. And he feels no remorse over this. He doesn't really feel capable of feeling remorse in general. And by the end of the book, all he can hope for is that there's a lot of people at his execution and they're all mad at him. Okay, there's the spoiler for Camus. I warned you there'd be a spoiler. Or for The Stranger by Camus. It's a artistically brilliant book, but I couldn't say that it teaches a good moral, except insofar as it makes you say, I want to be nothing like Meursault. Is the idea, where would that kind of work fall? Is this a good, no. So it's good artistically, but bad in terms of morals? Is that the good, bad book? Is that right?
Yeah, Camus is certainly good in terms of art. There's no doubt about that. As regards to morality, the key thing is what impact does his work have on our understanding of goodness, truth, and beauty? Let me give some parallels. I don't know Camus well, and so I would be on shallow ground, and you know more than I would, so I'd let you do the talking, which is nothing wrong with that either. But I'll give you some similar examples. The French decadent author Joris Karl Huysmans wrote what's sometimes called the decadent classic. It's called A Rebours, which is normally translated either as Against the Grain or Against Nature. And basically in that book, the protagonist of the novel is quite frankly so rich and without attachments with his neighbours. So a soul, if you like, a soul alone in the cosmos, and he's able, because of his wealth and his not being attached to other people, to indulge every single one of his sensual passions. So the whole of the novel basically is his indulging all the five senses in whatever sensual, passionate way he wants. So it's a whole litany of decadence, basically. But at the end of the book, in the final pages of the book, there's a cri de coeur, a cry from the heart to a God he doesn't even knows exists for help. In other words, and Huysmans, by the way, eventually becomes a convert to Catholicism. So you can actually see the seeds of it, if you like. But the book was called The Decadent Handbook. It was certainly used and abused by people who wanted to justify immoral lifestyles. So the question is, there, of course, I personally think that book is a good book, but there's a caveat. So I've written a series of essays over the last few weeks about the ideal high school classical literature curriculum. And some books, for instance, I say, look, really great books like Kristen Laven's Data by Sigrid Undset, The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene, Bright Heavily Visited by Evelyn Waugh, should not be on the high school curriculum because high school aged students have not attained the psychological and the emotional maturity to understand those works and could possibly even be harmed by them. So, for instance, with Huysman's book, would I advise undergraduates that haven't indulged most of the essential appetites to get ideas in their head? It might be better not there. Uh, no, I would not advise them to read that book. But if someone's already lived a thoroughly decadent lifestyle and has made all the mistakes, or most of the mistakes that the protagonist of that novel makes, and they're going to basically sympathize and empathize with the path he takes, and with the protagonist, pray and in a cri de coeur, from the heart for help. Then yes, that book for those people in those circumstances is emphatically a good book. So there is what you mentioned about objectivity and subjectivity. Up to a point, it's the receptivity of the reader which is key. And if the reader cannot receive what's being shown forth, it might be better for them not to read it. So there is an element of discernment about which books are appropriate for which readers.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And it strikes me that one has to have a bit of self-knowledge as well as, awareness of what the book is doing, maybe just some guides to help them, to know whether a good artistic book is going to be good morally for them or not. For instance, with Camus, I mean, you could either say that you've had enough experience with kind of a, nihilistic way of seeing the world that you say, oh, seeing this is actually going to inspire in me an even greater trust in the sense that that is the way no one wants to live.
Right.
But if you're kind of intrigued by that, you might read it and be like, wow, this is like a great form of detachment. So that's intriguing to me. I want to ask, so where would a book like, and I don't even have to name one, but like that people might call like a guilty pleasure type of book. And I'll outline it this way. Guilty pleasure insofar as like, it's not good writing, but it's a fun story to get lost in. It's kind of escapist. Would that be a perhaps, insofar as it has a, not terribly immoral characters, a bad artistically, but a bad good book? Is that where that falls in this kind of T chart?
Yeah. So my general view on this is that recreational reading. I put? I mean, my one remaining secular passion is following a particular English Premier League soccer team. All right.
Who?
Now, Chelsea Football Club since I was
Ooh,
7 years old.
write a fiction book about their current ownership. Okay, we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah, well, I'm not necessarily happy with the current owners, but the point is that one's allegiance to a
Sure.
football team is like a marriage,
Mm-hmm.
better or worse, sickness, health, till death do us part. So I've seen many owners come and go, and it's not about the owners; it's about the team itself, the club itself. But anyway, the point is, would my time be better spent than sitting myself down in front of an EPL game and watching a live game? I don't do it all that often actually because we don't have a TV and what have you. But I do occasionally go to the bar, with or without friends and watch a game. Could I be doing better things in my time? Yes, quite frankly. But we all have recreational time, and we can't all be on all the time. So generally speaking, I advise people to read good books because I think if we only have a limited amount of recreational time, because most of us are very busy for one reason or another, then we should be prudent and temperate about what we choose to read recreationally. But it should be something we enjoy. So I would really say that if we're only happy reading trash and trivia, perhaps we need to sort of man up, shall we say? We should start trying to lift heavier weights and not be happy being wimps. I mean, a friend of mine gave me a whole batch of 20 or 30 Ngao Marsh novels, and she is one of the queens of crime, along with Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. And these are not trash fiction. These are well crafted stories, but they're light, fair. I read them occasionally because sometimes I fancy reading light fare, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if that becomes the norm, I think perhaps we're cheating ourselves of something which has more gravitas, that might edify us more, that might lead us closer to reality, and ultimately, of course, that's God. So, by all means, let's put our feet up, and watch a soccer game or read some trash fiction occasionally, but let's not make it the rule. Let's make it the exception.
I think that's wise, right? There's a balance there, and we want people to enjoy reading, right? I mean, just getting people to read is enough of a challenge in a lot of circles, and then I think encouraging people that books that might feel like an acquired taste or might take a little longer, might be a little bit of a slower burn, often have the characters and the stories that stick with you for much longer, and you'll be glad you didn't give up. And kind of speaking on that theme, we've talked about what makes a book good, but what makes a good reader?
That's another great question. The first thing I would say, I get a little bit controversial here just because it's fun. You're a theologian, so it makes it even more fun. Sometimes I ask people with the rhetorical question, what's the greatest of all the virtues? And of course, everybody thinks immediately of St. Paul, quite correctly, and say charity, right? Love is the greatest of the virtues. And that's true. I'm not going to argue with St. Paul. But I would then, if you like, ask us to think outside the box a bit and say, what's the first and the worst of sins? To which the answer is pride. And because God does not create evil things, evil is not a thing, it's the absence of a thing. So the correct definition of pride is the absence of humility. So if the worst and the first of sins is the absence of humility, it could and should be argued that humility is the greatest of the virtues. And I would also, before people start casting stones at me for contradicting St. Paul, to say that a Christian understanding of love, charity, is to freely choose, to rationally choose to lay down your life for the other, for the beloved, even if the beloved is your enemy. So it has nothing to do with feelings. So that's impossible without humility. So humility and love are if not necessarily the same, they're certainly inseparable. They're indissolubly married. So anyway, the reason I say that is the good reader is one who has humility, and the reason I say that is going back to teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and others. It's what they don't put it in these terms. I put it in these terms just for rhetorical purposes. But they teach us about the 5 metaphysical senses. So we know our 5 physical senses, but the 5 metaphysical senses are sequential. They go in a certain order. One predicates the next. So humility is the first. If you have humility, you will have a sense of gratitude. If you have a sense of gratitude, your eyes will be opened in wonder. If your eyes open in wonder, you'll be moved to contemplation. And only if you move to contemplation will you experience dilation, dilatatio, the opening of the mind and the soul into the fullness of reality. So a good reader, and this, by the way, includes the reading of life, so watching a sunset or listening to the cicadas at night, the music of creation. To be a good reader is to read creation and read sub-creation, human art, literature, with humility, so that with a sense of gratitude, our eyes can be open to the wonder of the thing. And because our eyes are opened in gratitude to the wonder of the thing, we can then be moved to the contemplation that thing moves us to, and experience the dilation, the opening of our mind and heart to the fullness that thing brings to us. And with a great work of literature, it's like walking into a cathedral. It's bigger than we are. And we have to, if you like, read on our knees so that we can actually get the fullness of what it offers.
That's helpful. So I think we have an image of what a humble reader looks like, especially with the image you gave there at the end. But sometimes I find it helpful to also get at a thing by its inverse. So we've already mentioned that pride is the inverse of humility. And so being a good reader is being a humble reader. It would seem to indicate that being a bad reader would be a prideful reader. But what would it look like to be a prideful reader?
Well, that great philosopher up there with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas. I'm speaking, of course, of Jane Austen, um, who is a wonderful philosopher, actually, as well as being a great storyteller. She, one of probably her most famous novel, of course, is Pride and Prejudice. The point is that she knows what she's about. Pride is always inseparable from prejudice, because if you have pride, you don't see what's there; you see what you want to see. You see what you want to be there. So your eyes are actually closed to the fullness of what's in front of you because you only want to see what your pride it permits you to see. Which is why, if you look at the modern academy, they look at the great works of literature not through the eyes of the author, the eyes of the author and what the author's trying to do, but they dissect it. And as Wordsworth says, we kill to dissect, right? That they put it on the dissecting table, and they look at it from the perspective of Marxism or queer theory or feminism or whatever ideology we have at the moment, and they're not looking at the thing itself; they're imposing themselves upon it. That's pride and prejudice. That's why prideful readers are always a bad reader.
Oh, that's helpful. And I think it might be important here to distinguish that it's not that a pride, when you talk about dissecting, I imagine you aren't opposed to a reader really going into a text and trying to explore the full, capacious quality of the cathedral that it is, but it's that when they're imposing that prejudicial framework on top of it. Is that accurate?
Yes, I mean obviously that if you approach a text with humility, uh, 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 aligned with reason, because those two things again, without humility, we cannot even access reason because prejudice prevents us from doing so. That of course we're meant to look at a text and to analyze it and understand it on the deepest level that we can, but we have to understand it as something alive and bigger and better than we are. And sort of approach it with a sense of awe and not a sense of I am going to encapsulate this and put it in a test tube and show it to you, because you can't do that. Anybody can put the cathedral in the test tube and show it to me, right? You're smaller than the cathedral. You're inside it. You need to look around and understand and enjoy. Understand as best you can, by the way, because you can't encapsulate. But you can go deeper. And great works of literature, like great works of architecture, you can revisit over and over again and get new things from them every time. They're always there, but you were too small or too inattentive or too immature to see it last time. And you come back and with new eyes, if you like, you see things you hadn't seen before. Because what you're looking at is something which is alive, which is why I said dissecting, treating something, put it on the table and killing it in order to understand it is not the way to understand it at all.
I think there's an important point here, and I don't want to kind of dictate people's reading habits too much because I recognize that I probably have a lot more free time to read than people with, 4 kids under the age of 6 or something like that, right? But I think you're making as you talk about what you get as you return to a book, it strikes me that, you know, a good book is a book worth rereading. And so often we kind of have this approach to literature of like, it's almost like a bucket list approach. Like, how can I read as many great works, as possible? And that's not bad. But I think there is something so powerful in revisiting the books that are truly worth revisiting because you get more out of them, and perhaps revisiting them with other people. But we've talked a little bit about coming on the tail of imposing various frameworks onto the texts, and I think that's so common in our approach to literature today, especially in the academy. And it makes me wonder, within kind of all of our faulty ways of reading, is there a uniquely kind of Catholic approach, or does the Catholic faith, from which you write so often about literature, does it have a unique contribution to conversations about literature that you think maybe go missing?
Yeah, well, I think so, and they approach this in various ways. There's something which I call the hierarchy of creative value, which I sort of get from Tolkien, especially his essay on fairy stories and some of his other works, such as Leaf by Niggle and his poem Mythopoeia and others, and indeed his work and his letters. I mean, his corpus basically. But from that, I've come with this idea of a hierarchy of creative value. So at the top of this hierarchy of creative value is the creator himself. So God. And then you have creation, which are things made directly by God ex nihilo, right? And then you have what Tolkien calls subcreation, to distinguish it from creation, from God's creation. And these are things which we bring into being. But we can only bring things into being not ex nihilo, not from nothing, but from other things that already exist. So, I look, for instance, at a landscape painter, and I see that what he needs is an easel, a canvas, paintbrushes, oils, watercolors, his eyes, his hands, landscape, right, and light, and all of these things that exist already. But through the gifts he's been given, he can make something new. And so, this understanding of art as worship, art as giving back to the giver of the gift, the fruits of the gift given. That I think is something which is certain. I don't know if it's uniquely Catholic. It's certainly uniquely Christian. And so this idea that our own creative gifts are part of the Imago Dei in us. Again, let's unpack the Imago Dei again. Who we are. No, to be the Imago Dei is to the good, the true, the beautiful. To be able to love, to rationally choose to lay down our lives for others, to think, to reason, to come to the Logos through reason. And then the beautiful is the life in things, but also in some sense from the life we get from God giving life. So there's something about subcreation which is procreation, right? Bringing new life into being. And that, I think, is what art is in its most glorious form. And then Tolkien distinguishes between subcreation, the glory of God, so true art, art as it should be, good art, shall we say, and subcreation for the utility of man, so technology. And this is below, using our gifts to give glory back to God, praise. But we do need to have technology, right? We do need to have a roof over our heads and to be able to grow our food and to wear clothes and everything else. So this is a hierarchy of goods with God the creator at the top, creation, subcreation to the glory of God, and subcreation for the use of man. This is a hierarchy of goods. And that I think is a profoundly Christian, I don't know if it's specifically Catholic, way of understanding the creative process.
I love that, and I can't recommend that essay enough on fairy stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. Whether people just want to learn more about how Tolkien thinks, but also if they really want to think about art and subcreation, it's fascinating. It's not too long. I think people will enjoy it. I just asked this question of, is there a uniquely kind of Catholic or Christian view of literature? And then I want to pivot on the other hand to this kind of category. I think we've thrown it out already in this conversation of Christian literature, because I've encountered people with very differing opinions on the utility of that category in general. You write in your book, even as the New Testament baptizes the Old Testament, so Boethius and Augustine baptize Plato and Thomas Aquinas baptizes Aristotle, Dante baptizes Homer and Virgil, and Shakespeare baptizes Sophocles. And so with this idea of kind of like baptizing non-Christian writers, is it still conceptually helpful, you think, to talk about Christian literature? I believe C.S. Lewis once said something about books not having a religion insofar as that. But should we use this category?
Oh, I think we have. I think we have no option but to do so. And irrespective of, I'll say something about why Lewis and Tolkien. Um, okay, you're going to have to take a step back. You've asked the question. You brought Lewis and you quoted Lewis. So basically, it's all about what we mean by allegory. Okay, so allegory is from the Greek alloskoros. I'm probably pronouncing the Greek wrong. I don't do Greek, but it's basically the other thing that something that speaks of another thing. So a thing that speaks of another, right? Something which points beyond itself. So they were they did not like formal allegory. All right, so something like John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, right, where Christian is the Christian, right, where the slough of despond is despair. So there's places and people and characters. There's the giant despair himself, of course. This is a formal allegory where there are no real characters. Every character is a personified abstraction, just cardboard cutout representing an idea, right? They don't like that, and I understand why they don't like that. It has its place, however. Um, but what they preferred is that the allegorical dimension would be subsumed within the story. In other words, much more subtle. But Tolkien's a Catholic, and Lewis is an Anglican who I'm sure understands Augustine's and particularly Aquinas' understanding the reading of Scripture. That the reading of Scripture has four levels of meaning, only one of which is literal, and the other three are allegorical. So, in other words, we have to read literature. We have to read Scripture itself. We have to read the Bible itself literarily. If we don't read the Bible literarily, we're only going to read it literally. If we only read it literally, we're not understanding it. So, yeah, as Aquinas says, that basically you have to see that the Old Testament is in an allegorical conversation with the New Testament. The Old Testament prefigures the New Testament. The New Testament fulfills and makes manifest those things that were through a glass darkly in the Old Testament. There's a conversation, right, between the Old Testament and New Testament, which is an allegorical conversation. And then when we read Scripture, we're not just meant to see the relationship between the Old and New Testament, we're meant to see how it relates to us personally, morally, right? The moral dimension. How does it speak to me and what I should be doing? And then finally, the third level of allegorical meaning is the anagogical, how all of this relates to eternity and my personal destiny within eternity, death, judgment, heaven or hell, right? So the Bible has to be read literarily. And at the most basic level, every single word that we utter or write is an allegory. If you don't speak English and I utter a monosyllabic grunt, dog, right, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you speak the language, that monosyllabic grunt, dog, brings to your mind allegorically, because the grunt speaks of something else, a four-legged canine animal, right? If we reverse the letters, or each of those letters is also an allegory, a squiggle which signifies a word, a sound. We reverse dog, it becomes God, it means something completely different. So, the point is that Lewis and Tolkien, of course, was a philologist at Oxford University. They understood this, right? So, of course, there's an allegory is inescapable in the most basic aspects of life, but they didn't like formal allegory. So they don't want Christian literature to preach, right? When literature preaches, it loses its power. That for literature to teach that the lesson has to be subsumed within the narrative and not floating on the surface, and that's really what they mean, that subtlety and that nuance. But is the Great Divorce by Lewis Christian literature? Yes. Is the Lord of the Rings Christian literature? Yes. And by the way, don't take my word for it. J.R.R. Tolkien said, and I'm quoting him here word for word, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So, Lord of the Rings is not just Christian, it's Catholic and fundamentally so. So, Tolkien and Lewis themselves, when they let their guard down, state the obvious.
So there's some interesting things I want to follow up on here, not least of which will be how Tolkien and Lewis then apply these things differently, because their approach to allegory is certainly, while they might share some common sentiments about what it shouldn't be, the way they apply it in their works, at least as far as Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, and the Lord of the Rings, I think is pretty different. And so I think we'll get into that in just a second. But I think it's worth circling back here because we've said that, okay, so Christian literature is a helpful category, everything from The Great Divorce to The Lord of the Rings, they are Christian books. If we go back to our framework, though, of what makes a book good, it strikes me that when we talk about the book is good morally, it probably doesn't have to make that jump into, and it's therefore a Christian book, or does it? Like, if we say something like, these people that are being baptized, right? So if we have like the Iliad and the Odyssey, are they Christian books, or are they still good moral books without being Christian books?
Well, I said something fairly recently. I wrote something fairly recently, which I'm sure is controversial. I like controversy. That for me, the Iliad and the Odyssey are more Christian than Paradise Lost. Because Paradise Lost is Milton is walking away from Jesus Christ. He has denied the Trinity. I think states explicitly. Lewis would say implicitly. He doesn't. But either way, we can agree to differ. That God the Son, or it's not the Son. He's not God. The Father is God. The Son is a creature in Paradise Lost. So there's no belief in the Trinity. There's no belief in the Incarnation. Well, they're the two essential ingredients, if you like, of what Christianity is. Right? It's the Trinity and the Incarnation. And Milton's walking away from that, whereas I would say that Homer is walking towards it, as the Greek philosophers are moving towards an understanding of the Logos. So what we see, I think, in the classical world, particularly in Greece, is that God is preparing the Jews theologically for the moment of the Incarnation. He's preparing the Greeks philosophically for the moment of the Incarnation. He's also preparing the Greeks as storytellers, both in the works of the epics of Homer, but also in dramas such as that by Sophocles, which were really deep, penetrative insights into the mystery and meaning of suffering and its relationship to the divine. I mean, these are all asking the right questions, and up to a point, getting at least hints of the right answers. God, of course, through Jesus Christ, reveals those answers explicitly, but I think implicitly, the Greeks are already getting an inkling of it. So that what we're seeing with Augustine takes Plato, because Plato's already basically got it right, but with the insights that Jesus Christ gives, he can baptize it. So the Aquinas can baptize Aristotle, and Dante can baptize Virgil and Homer, and Shakespeare can baptize Sophocles.
Okay, so that makes sense. And so am I hearing that they, even if we're not going to call them Christian books, they're more like they're at least shading into that direction, right? I mean,
they show inklings of Christianity. They're groping towards the light of Christianity. I would even be tempted to call them proto-Christian.
Okay. And I mean, I guess this relates to the idea that like all truth is God's truth, right? Like this idea that to the extent that they're coming to the right conclusions, or at least getting on the right trajectory, we as Christians can own that. You used the word inkling, though, which brings us back to Lewis and Tolkien of their famous reading group there at Oxford, right? But I think they're helpful in this kind of conversation. We've talked about allegory, and I think they're also a great kind of on-ramp for people into this conversation. They might not even consider themselves great books people, but they love The Lord of the Rings, so they love Narnia, or other works by those two. So what can we learn about the different ways they approach things? Because if one reads, let's say you read Narnia first, which kind of developmentally, it makes sense that you'd read that first. You say, oh, like Aslan, that's Christ. Okay, this is easy. Like, I get that. Like, Aslan was sacrificed, Christ was sacrificed. I can make these connections. And then you pick up Lord of the Rings and you say, yeah, these two were friends. They're going to be doing similar things. They're both Christian writers. These are Christian books. And you start going, and you're like, is Gandalf Christ? Is like, what is Frodo? Who does Frodo represent? It gets a little more murky. It's less clear. What can we learn from these kind of different approaches?
Yeah, very good. I mean, first of all, that Lewis, as much as he didn't like the idea of preaching in his literature, was always tempted to do so. Lewis was always a teacher and often a preacher, even if he didn't want to be. That's why by the way, I believe he thought Till We Have Faces was his greatest work, because it was the only literary work that he managed to write without preaching. But Tolkien was not interested in preaching. He believed that the truth would emerge from the story. But again, let's continue that quote by Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously at first, consciously in the revision. So with two things going on, he tells the story, not trying to teach or preach at all, he just wants to tell a good story. And of course, the Christianity, the fundamental religious and Catholic dimension of it is going to be present, because it's an incarnate work of art by someone who's profoundly Catholic. It's going to be manifest, because it's an incarnation of this own person's psyche, his deepest held beliefs, his understanding of the cosmos, of humanity, of relationships. It's all going to be there, subsumed anyway. But then conscious in the revision. What does that mean? And here we have to understand that Tolkien is very much part of the history of the great books. If you look at, so Tolkien was a medievalist, of course. He translated Beowulf. No, I don't want to spend too long time talking about this. But if you look at the third part of Beowulf, there are numerical signifiers, right? So Beowulf handpicks 12 followers. So, if you read literarily, when someone handpicks 12 followers, immediately your antennae should be twitching. Hang on a second, something might be happening here. One of the 12 betrays the people by stealing from the dragon, raising the dragon's wrath. Beowulf then has to face the dragon in mortal combat. He kills the dragon but dies himself in the process. Only one of the remaining 11 has the courage to stand by him during that trial to the death. So you're only one of the handpicked 12, right? The other 10 run away into the woods. At the end, however, they build a burial mound signifying the church with 12 followers, knights in armor, galloping around in a circle, signifying eternity, right? So the last part of Beowulf, just by using numerical signifiers, is an analogy of the gospel. Now, look at other works. Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante is lost in the dark wood of sin on Maundy Thursday, right, on Holy Thursday. He descends into hell on Good Friday. He emerges in the light of the sun at the foot of Mount Purgatory on Easter Sunday morning. So there's this liturgical thing going on there. In Sir Gawain the Green Knight, which Tolkien translated, the story begins at Christmas. Sir Gawain just decides to go out on his quest to find the Green Knight on All Saints' Day, and then goes to confession as an act of penance on All Souls' Day, which is November the 2nd, a penitential day. And then he's looking unsuccessfully for the Green Knight and finds himself lost in the desert of North Wales during Advent, so a penitential season, prays on Christmas Eve, and the Green Knight's castle appears magically before him. So how does this play itself out for Tolkien? Well, Tolkien has the ring destroyed on March the 25th. March the 25th is the date of the Annunciation, but it's also traditionally believed to be the historic date of the crucifixion. So having the ring destroyed on the date of both the incarnation and the death of Christ, coupled with the resurrection, of course, is our redemption. What's destroyed by that? Well, the power of sin. So if the ring is destroyed on March the 25th and sin is destroyed on March the 25th, it makes the ring synonymous with sin. And once you've got that, you can unpack everything else. And Tolkien has the Fellowship of the Ring leaving Rivendell on December the 25th. So that the journey of Frodo from Rivendell to Mount Doom, Golgotha, is the life of Jesus Christ from the date of his birth to the date of his death. So, and I could carry on, right? But so you see, so Tolkien is definitely being consciously Catholic in the telling of the tale by giving these liturgical clues, but not in a way that's going to get in the way. So most people, for instance, when they read The Lord of the Rings, have no idea about that. They have to go deeper. This is why a work of art, like a cathedral, you revisit, you come back, and you see things second or third reading you hadn't seen first time, and it keeps growing and growing.
And if people want to get more, they should check out your book, Frodo's Journey. And I'm sure they can learn even more. I'll make that plug for you here. This has been really fun, and I've just got a couple more questions for you. But we've been talking about two great English writers, and I'd be remiss not to talk about the Bard himself as we talk about English writers. Now, you've recently written a book on the history of England, which I think could be a fascinating conversation all in itself. And England has produced some incredible writers, but I mean, everyone stands in the shadow of Shakespeare. You've written on Shakespeare. You've done, I believe, like an EWTN special on Shakespeare, or a series on Shakespeare, if I've got that right. But what makes Shakespeare so special? Because I think there'll be people listening to this who say like, yeah, I read like King Henry IV or Romeo and Juliet in high school, and I don't know, it wasn't for me, and I've never returned. But they should. Why should they?
Well, there's a few ways of approaching this. First of all, for me, the three giants. I don't know if it's colossuses or colossi, but the three giants, three colossuses that straddle the millennia as regards literature are Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. So the Shakespeare's up there with the best of the best. Well, a few things. I've written 3 books on Shakespeare and done two TV series on him, so I have dug deeply. That Shakespeare was almost certainly a believing Catholic at a time when it was illegal to be a Catholic in England and punishable by death to be a priest, punishable by death to hide a priest from the authorities. So the first of my books looks at the biographical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism at this time when it's deadly to be a Catholic. And then my second and third book look at the Catholic dimension in the plays. The problem with most people's reading of Shakespeare is that most people who teach Shakespeare don't know how to read Shakespeare, and then therefore they can't actually relay that to the students, particularly high school students. It's what I call Shakespeare abuse. Shakespeare is invariably taught badly and therefore invariably read badly by students, and therefore the students walk away from it and say, well, that didn't do anything for me. When you actually understand Shakespeare on the deepest level, I mean, I don't even know where to start, quite frankly. I'm going to start with his greatest play, May Eurydice, is King Lear. And the key thing about King Lear is what is madness, right? When St. Francis strips himself naked of all his worldly possessions, hands his very clothes back to his father, and walks off naked into the woods to marry, to wed Lady Poverty for the rest of his life. Is that madness? Isn't it sanity to keep your clothes on and to be comfortable in this life, and to pursue the creature comforts? Is it not mad to want to carry your cross, to seek your cross, to marry Lady Poverty? Is that not madness? So in King Lear, this is played out. When is Lear mad? Is he mad when he's seeking only his own comfort, or is he mad when he strips himself naked in the heath? By the way, signaled twice by the singing of a Franciscan ballad, so that Shakespeare's making the connection, which his own audience would certainly have known, with St. Francis, that King Lear suffers from the madness of religious conversion, and dies deliriously happy with a vision of the resurrected Cordelia. But is that just because he's mad? So again, Shakespeare's sort of, really asking the most fundamental questions. What is sanity? And what he's suggesting in that play, and is in many of his other plays, is that sanity and sanctity are the same thing. That ultimately reason and laying down your life for your friends, for which there's no greater love, are the same thing. There's nothing more rational than choosing to give yourself sacrificially to another in love. So this is the paradox at the heart of his greatest play. And we see these sorts of deep, profound paradoxes in all of Shakespeare's work, even the comedies. So is he worth reading? Absolutely.
I love that. And I'll just add, for those that, are maybe wanting to get back into it, go and support your local theater when they put on Shakespeare. See it on stage, and I think it'll then go read it. If you struggle to read it at first, I think seeing it will be very helpful. But I can't recommend it enough as well. So speaking of recommending, I'm going to land the plane here. I could talk about this all day, and genuinely would enjoy doing it. But I want to end with some book recommendations before we just do the rapid fire questions. But you give a long list of books in your work, literature, whatever Catholics should know, and you kind of go through the good books. I forget what it is. It might be 50. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And then you have okay. And then you have other books that look at top Catholic writers and such. But I want to say, someone listening to this, they're interested, but maybe they're a bit new to the great works. Let's say 5 books. That gives them 2 months per book, and one takes 3, or they take a month off. 5 books to read in the next year. what 5 would you recommend?
Well, that's a great question because one of the difficulties when people ask me which Chesterton's books should I read first, for instance. Well, I need to know something about you, or which of my own books should I read first? I need something about you. So, but we'll leave that to one side, and I'm going to assume that we have a tabula rasa here,
Mm-hmm.
a blank slate, that these people haven't read any of the books. So, on the assumption they haven't read any of the 100 books on that list of great books, I think it's important for them to begin with the best and the most important. So the 5, I would put, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but if only got 5, probably one has to go, unless you should have me a combined volume.
I'll let you have
So
them
if
together.
we have them together,
Yeah.
good. In fact, you force me to choose. I say the Odyssey, but it makes me squirm because they're both brilliant. So so the Iliad and the Odyssey as a combined volume would be first. Dante's Divine Comedy, an absolute master, and I would suggest the Penguin edition with Dorothy L. Sayers' translation and notes for reasons I won't bore you with now. But it's very important in the Dante's Divine Comedy to have good notes, and the most important thing about the notes is that the person writing them has to be Thomistic. They have to understand the philosophy and theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, because Dante was a disciple of Aquinas. And if you don't understand that, you won't understand what Dante's doing. So Dante would be second. I've cheated when I have the desert island question. What books would you take to the desert island? I always say the complete works of Shakespeare. That's probably cheating, and they wouldn't be able to read that in a whole year. So
I can't give you that.
That would be unfair. So I've mentioned King Lear. So we're only going to read one play by Shakespeare. I'd say King Lear. So that's 3. The Lord of the Rings, to me, that is one of the great books. I have no real doubt that, the people are still reading at all 400 years from now. That will be in the canon of the great books. It's already the 3rd largest selling work of literature of all time. And then, so the more difficult for me would be the 5th, because then you got loads that are sort of vying for that position. I would probably say Kristen Lavransdatter, by Sigrid Undset, which is an absolute epic. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature for writing it, and it's hard going. I sometimes say, if you imagine Lord of the Rings, imagine Jane Austen meets J.R.R. Tolkien, and they collaborate on a medieval epic, and that's what you got with the Kristen Lavransdatter. So I would suggest that they got their work cut out because you made them read both epics, and Kristen Lavransdatter is actually 3 volumes like Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings is also chunky. So they got their work cut out. King Lear would be easy by comparison. That's 3 hours work, 3 hours reading.
All right. Well, I've got some homework because I have not read the last of those, so I will put it on my list. But Joseph, this has been so much fun. Thank you again. The links will be in the description. But now we'll just roll into the final 4 rapid fire questions that I ask all of my guests. The first is, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Well, one's simple, one's more abstract. So I'm giving 2, which is pretty cheating. Years ago, part of my conversion process, I came up with an idea for myself, a sort of a modus vivendi for myself, which I call the healthy trinity. But I try to find time every day for physical, spiritual, and intellectual exercise, and keeping it like an equilateral triangle. And so I've lived that, or I endeavored to live that for the last 30 plus years, and that's been crucial. And the other thing, the simple thing, silence. So disconnect, stop being distracted by gadgets, which have become godgets. We spend more time with our gadgets than we do with our God. Go out, watch the sunset, listen to the birds. Just don't even read, right? Find some silence. And if you've got to pray, one of the most powerful prayers is silence. In other words, listen. Don't talk, listen. So silence is the other thing I would suggest.
I love both of those recommendations. This is a very difficult question to ask all of my guests, but I'm guessing you specifically. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life? Doesn't mean it's the best book, but the most impactful book on your life.
Yeah, it's much easier for me to say the most impactful writer. It's easy. And that's G.K. Chesterton. My first book as a Catholic was my biography of Chesterton, and I sometimes say that was an act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton, but also to Chesterton for giving me God. So it's
Mm-hmm.
easy to say Chesterton. What's more difficult to say which of his books has been the most impactful? In some sense, the first would be impactful because that's what turned me on to him. And that would be The Well and the Shallows, a very unknown book of essays. But maybe on a deeper level, his book, The Everlasting Man. And basically, my view, The Everlasting Man impacted me exactly the same way it impacted C.S. Lewis. When C.S. Lewis first read The Everlasting Man, he said, I saw the Christian outline of history laid out before me in a way that made sense. Lewis was not a believer when he read it. I was not a believer when I read The Everlasting Man either. And it's the first time I managed to see the outline of history as a Christian understands it, with God at the center and the incarnation at the center.
Wonderful. Well, building off of that, if you could go back in time to your younger self, let's say, right when you were converting, what's one piece of advice you would give yourself?
Yeah, again, the Malcolm Muggeridge, who people your generation haven't even heard of, I'm sure. But he became a Catholic. He lived a very immoral life. He's a serial fornicator, a Marxist, a decadent. And when he was 78 years old, he became a Catholic. And a cynical journalist said, "Well, you know." Now that you're too old to have fun, you become a Catholic. What do you think about those who aren't too old to have fun? And Muggeridge responded that I regret all my sins, especially where they have hurt others. And he would have been thinking especially of his wife. But I can't regret the path because it led me to the foot of the cross. So in one sense, I wouldn't want to be what should I say, presumptuous enough to give my young, angry, foolish self advice, because he was by hook or by crook and by the grace of God, staggering in the right direction, even though he didn't know it. So that's the first thing. I probably wouldn't give him advice. But in a broader sense, something I learned at some point, and some comes back to what we said earlier about aquinas and the five metaphysical senses. If you want to see, you have to look. So the point is, I walked around myopically with my eyes closed and blinded by ideology, and it prevented me from seeing the fullness of reality. And you have to look if you want to see the fullness of reality, especially the beauty of reality. If you want to see, you have to look.
Wonderful. Final question. In a sentence, what is the gospel?
The gospel, I mean, I'm going to give the obvious answer. It's the good news. It's the good news of God being manifest in the person of Jesus Christ. And the important thing about that is, there's a wonderful novel which I recommend by Chesterton called The Man Who Was Thursday. And this is about the quest of six philosophers to come to understand God. And the character Sunday, who's the mysterious presence of God, ultimately in the novel, that's a spoiler as well, by the way, for those who haven't read it. He basically says, you'll understand everything before you understand me. The point is that we cannot understand God. Philosophy will take us so far, even to the threshold. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle will take us so far. But if we're going to be taken across the threshold, God has to come out, cross the threshold to us, and then walk us into his kingdom. And that's what the gospel is that Jesus Christ becoming one of us, crossing the threshold into incarnate space so that he can show us the fullness of God, which is impossible for us to understand without that revelation.
Joseph Pearce, thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure.